All right, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second virtual Meet the Astronomer for the month of December. So I'm Dr. Billy Tietz, and I'm the acting director and the outreach astronomer here at Vanderbilt University's Dyer Observatory. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank some folks that have been working behind the scenes, my colleagues here at the Dyer Observatory, Alex Rockefeller, Nathan Griffin, and Helen Morissette. And then also Brian Smokler of VU News and Communications, who's making sure that we're being heard by you all this evening. So before we get started, I just wanted to give you all a little reminder of one event that we're going to be doing next Monday, hopefully, if the weather permits. So if you look behind me, you'll see a view we had of the Dyer Observatory about a week and a half ago. And you'll notice that there are two bright objects just above the telescope dome. And so that's Jupiter and Saturn. And this Monday, if weather permits, Dyer Observatory will be doing a live viewing from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. of a conjunction, which the planets will appear very close to one another. So this is a very special conjunction because the planets will not have appeared this close to one another in our sky for at least 400 years. Depends on who you ask. It might be 800 years if you really want to get technical with it. But we'll be doing that from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. This coming Monday. So go to our website. There's a link to the live view. I'll be there answering questions, describing what we're seeing. But I also want to encourage every one of you on the next few nights to go out and look at these planets with just your naked eye and watch them get closer and closer over the coming few days, because it'll be another 80 years before they will appear this close together in our sky. So for some of us, it might be a once in a lifetime event, so make sure not to miss it. So I want to introduce our speaker tonight. So Dr. David Weintraub received his bachelor's degree in physics and astronomy from Yale in 1980, and then went on to get a PhD in geophysics and space physics at the UCLA in 1989. He's professor of astronomy right here at Vanderbilt University, and his research focuses around the formation of stars and planets. He also is the founder and he directs the Communication of Science program at the university as well. He was the 2015 winner of the Klopstad Award from the American Association of Physics Teachers, which recognizes the outstanding communication of the excitement of contemporary physics to the general public. In his spare time, he is also a prolific author. He has written a few books that make great stocking stuffers. The first one that we'll mention tonight is Life on Mars, What to Know Before We Go. That was published in 2018, and it's been translated into Chinese, Korean, Spanish, Turkish, and Polish. Tells you right there it's going to be very interesting, and was released or re-released in an updated paperback edition just this past November, and just in time for the arrival of the NASA and European Space Agency rovers to Mars this February. His previous books also include Religions and Extraterrestrial Life in 2014, How Old is the Universe? And then last but certainly not least is Pluto a Planet? So be sure to check these out. They're all great reads, lots of info in there. Dr. Weintraub has been a very close friend of Dyer Observatory for about 2 decades now. He's very passionate in education and outreach to the public, and that's our mission here at the observatory. So he works with us on numerous occasions every year in our space camps, in our lectures like tonight, even helps out sometimes at our Bluebird on the Mountain concerts. So I can't say enough good things about him. But tonight, he's going to be discussing a topic that's been in the news lately. With this planetary conjunction coming up, a lot of people have been mentioning the Star of Bethlehem. But tonight we're going to have a discussion about if astronomy can possibly explain the Star of Bethlehem. So we encourage you to ask questions. We have a chat feature on YouTube. Be sure to put your questions in there. And as they come to your mind, enter them then. Don't wait to the very end. And once we get to the end of the program, then we'll be taking questions, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. So without further ado, Dr. Weintraub, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to have you speaking. So let me turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Billy. First thing I'm going to do after saying hello and saying thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight is I'm going to see if you've given me back the privileges to share my screen. And it looks like you have. So you should now see my slides and we'll take it from there. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the Star of Bethlehem and whether astronomy has anything to say to help us understand the story that we find in the book of Matthew about the Star of Bethlehem. So this is just a screen to get us started, but what I want to start with here is, if I can make my mouse work, is this slide. This is the text from Matthew. This is the only place we have that says anything about a star for Christmas. So let's read through this together because there are a number of phrases in here that we need to pay very close attention to. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising." At its rising is sometimes translated as in the east, "and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet." And the words of the prophet are these, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there, ahead of them, went the star. That's the mention of the star again, that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. That's the text of Matthew that we need to understand if we want to understand the Star of Bethlehem. There are a number of questions I'd like you to think about, so let me take you through some of them. Who were the wise men? Why were they called wise in the first place? They're also, wise men is often translated as magi, and note that in the text there are not three of them, and they're not referred to as kings. Why did they travel to Jerusalem to see King Herod in the first place? Why didn't they just follow the star directly to Bethlehem? Why did they come long after Jesus was born asking about a child and not a baby? How did they know to ask for news of a newborn king? And why did they assume that Herod already knew about this birth? Now, Herod apparently didn't know. Why were King Herod and his scribes and high priests unaware of the star? Why didn't they know about this star? Was the star too faint to be visible? The Magi, we're told, observed the star, but did they actually follow a star, a bright thing in the sky? And why did Herod need to know the exact time when the star had appeared? Why would that matter? All right, about the wise men. If the wise men came from the east, think about your geography. How did they follow a star in the east to Jerusalem? Did the wise men follow the star before they came to see Herod, or only after? And how did a star in the east lead them directly south from Jerusalem to Bethlehem? And then how could a star stop over the place where the child was? Finally, why did Herod have all the children under 2 years old killed? This is a map of ancient Judea and the Middle East. And I just want you to have this picture in mind. We have Babylon here, which is probably where the wise men came from. We have Jerusalem over here in Judea. If you were in Babylon and you wanted to get to Jerusalem, you would not walk across what is now the Jordanian desert. It just didn't happen. If you wanted to go from Babylon to Jerusalem, you went up the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You ended up here in Syria, and you came down the coast, down through Lebanon, and you ended up in Jerusalem. You did not go from Babylon directly west to get to Jerusalem. Now, in ancient Judea, we see Jerusalem right here, and we see Bethlehem directly south of Jerusalem. So the wise men came to Jerusalem to see King Herod, and after seeing King Herod, they followed the star in the east. East is to your right, and they went south to Bethlehem. That doesn't make a whole lot of physical sense. Perhaps we need a different explanation. Was the Star of Bethlehem a comet? No. A comet would have been visible to everybody, and King Herod and his wise men they were ignorant of this bright thing in the sky. In addition, comets were ignored by anybody who had been looking for a good omen 2,000 years ago. People generally feared comets. Comets were harbingers of disasters. They foretold the deaths of kings. Historically, we know that a comet appeared in 44 BCE. This was just after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Augustus Caesar argued that the comet was the wandering soul of Julius Caesar. That's not good news. The historian Pliny the Elder remarked that the only place in the whole world where a comet is the object of worship is in a temple at Rome. Nobody worshiped comets. Nobody thought comets were good things. Another comet appeared in year 64 CE. In that year, great fires swept through Rome, and Emperor Nero had many leading citizens killed. He was trying to fend off conspiracies. 4 years later, he committed suicide. That comet did not bring good news. And the comet 15 years later was used by Roman Emperor Vespasian to foretell the death of the Parthian king, his enemy. The Parthian king didn't die, but Vespasian died that year. Not good news. Ptolemy, the greatest astronomer of antiquity, about a century later, commented in his writings that comets naturally produce misfortune. You cannot explain the Star of Bethlehem as a comet. Could the Star of Bethlehem have been a supernova? No. Supernovae would have been bright and visible even in the daytime sky to anybody who looked. And again, King Herod and the wise men had no idea there was a star in the sky. They had to ask about it. Supernovae would have been ignored, but more to the point, the wise people at the time didn't actually believe that bright new stars could exist at all. Aristotle had said that no new stars could come into existence. Aristotle said the heavens were immutable. They were perfect. They were unchangeable. So no one would have been looking for a new star because nobody believed that new stars could even exist. They weren't possible. An ancient astronomer, Hipparchus, may have observed one in 126 BCE, but he gave it no significance and it was roundly ignored. Chinese astronomers did observe a supernova in 5 BCE. This is close to the right era, but there's no record of that supernova being seen in the Western world. Supernovae were just not on anybody's radar screen for paying attention to them, not a supernova. Could the Star of Bethlehem have been a planetary conjunction like the one we will have next week? And my answer is maybe, kind of, sort of. We're going to see that planetary conjunctions play a role in the story I'm going to tell you, but not because they are bright things in the sky. They're important because of what they signify. In this wonderful image, you've got the moon on the top right, you have Venus in the upper left, and then Jupiter at the bottom right. It's a wonderful conjunction, but this is not what the Star of Bethlehem was. The Star of Bethlehem, if there was any Star of Bethlehem at all, was not a bright object in the sky or collection of objects in the sky for anybody to look at. Let's go backwards now. We need to learn a bit about what astronomy was like 2,000 years ago. And I want to start with the Babylonians. Prior to the 6th century BCE, the Babylonians had made systematic observations of the heavens for a long time. They recorded observations for more than 1,000 years. And in 748, they began to make regular, almost daily observations. And from those observations, they discovered something. In this image, you see a time-lapse image of the sky where stars rise in the east. They go around these circles centered on the North Star, and they set in the west. This is because of the rotation of the Earth, but the ancients, of course, thought that the Earth was fixed at the center of the universe, and the stars went around the Earth in big circles, and you see those circles here. The Babylonians observed the sky, and they discovered that the planets have periods, and we'll see how the planets move through the stars in a few minutes. But they discovered that Mars had periods of both 47 and 79 years. They discovered a period for Jupiter of 71 and 83 years, for Saturn of 59 years, for Mercury of 46 years, for Venus an astounding 1,151 years. They discovered a cycle of eclipses we call the Saros cycle, which is more than 6,000 days in length. They discovered a cycle called the Metonic cycle, in which the moon returns to the same lunar phase on the same date on the calendar every 235 lunar months. To discover these kinds of periodicities in the things happening in the sky, you need to make observations for hundreds of years. And that's what they did. So by the 6th century BCE, they discovered all these things. They then moved on. Now, I want to show you in this video how we need to be thinking about the skies. So we see a number of planets. The ancients thought of the sun and the moon as planets. We also have Venus and Mercury and Saturn and Jupiter here. And I'm going to set this in motion for you. And as the planets move, you see the moon moving through the image. You see the planets moving. The planets are known to the ancients as wandering stars. That's what planet means in ancient Greek, wandering star. Let me try to pause this a moment for us. The planets, as you see them, are moving from your right to your left, but the sky is moving from your left to your right. So if you were watching the stars move, the stars would rise to your left, move across your screen and set to the right, and the planets are moving in the opposite direction. Keep all of that in mind. The normal motion of the planets is to wander through the stars in the opposite direction the stars move. The stars themselves, and I'll start this again, the stars themselves don't move. Watch the stars. The stars stay fixed. That's why you can find the Big Dipper now, and you could find the Big Dipper 50 years ago. The stars don't move. Let's move from Babylonian astronomy to Babylonian astrology, because that's where the Babylonians transitioned in about the middle of the first millennium BCE. Traditional Babylonian astrology, which was where they started, had to do with seers, wise people watching the sky. They built towers around Babylon and situated people in those towers just to watch the sky. Their job was to see anything interesting in the sky. Those could be bright sunsets, shooting stars, auroras. They reported those omens, these bright things in the sky, to the wise men in Babylon, who interpreted what was going on in the sky as messages from the gods that would reveal human fortunes, not the fortunes of individual people, but the fate of the country, the fate of the king. And if they predicted good things, the king would be happy. And if they didn't, the king would be unhappy. But the people who became the experts at interpreting these signs were the priests, the magi. Babylonian astrology then transitioned during the centuries 700 to 300 into what we call birth date Babylonian astrology. In this time period, they established the signs of the zodiac. They created their ideas in which different planets had different powers. So Mars would bring sickness and disease and war. They established the idea that the moments when stars and planets rise and set were important. Their astrology during this period was based on making observations of the heavens. And the first known natal astrological chart we know of from 410 BCE. Having started this, they fairly quickly abandoned it because they discovered that it didn't actually work. So by about 300 BCE, they'd pretty much abandoned this idea. But in about 323, Alexander the Great took his armies and had rolled through the Middle East and had extended the Greek Empire as far as Babylon and beyond. And all of the Babylonian observations, all of their records of what they knew about the sky passed into the hands of Greek astronomers. Greek astronomy very quickly became very, very mathematical. Eudoxus, who worked in about the 4th century BCE, figured out that there must be this thing called a leap year, and he made the first prediction of a solar eclipse that we think was accurate on May 12, 361. Callippus established that the year was 365 1/4 days, and his calendar is what Julius Caesar would use to create the Julian calendar about 300 years later that included an actual leap year. Aristarchus measured the distance to the moon and the distance to the sun, and he measured the length of the year he thought was accurate to within a few seconds. He was actually pretty close. Eratosthenes, a century later, actually measured the radius of the Earth to within 1%, which meant he then knew the distance to the moon within 1%, and he thought he knew the distance to the sun that accurately, and the distance to the stars. He measured what we call the obliquity of the Earth's axis, which is illustrated down here. It's the tilt of the Earth's axis relative to the position of the sun. That tilt is why we have seasons. And Eratosthenes created a catalog of the positions of stars with a few hundred stars. His successor was Hipparchus, about 100 years later, who created an even bigger catalog of about 1,000 stars with their positions. The positions of stars are recorded just like Nashville in Tennessee has a latitude and a longitude. The positions of the stars are recorded in the same way so that people can find them year after year. Hipparchus figured out there was this thing called precession, in which this rotation axis of the Earth wobbles in about 28,000 years. That's a long period of wobble, but the Earth wobbles like a spinning top. It just wobbles very slowly. And Hipparchus then figured out that he could create mathematical models for the motion of the sun and the moon as they move through the stars, which are accurate enough that we could use them today to make predictions about eclipses. He was not as good with his models for the planets, but he was pretty good. The result of Hipparchus's work was, from the time of Hipparchus and after, Greek astronomers felt that they did not need to make any more measurements. They didn't actually need to look at the sky. They could just use their math to calculate what they knew would be happening in the sky. So astrologers who had become astronomers now became mathematici. They became mathematicians. Let's come back to the Magi. The Magi is the root of our word magician. The title was originally given to Zoroastrian priests who were beaten and slaughtered by King Darius in the 5th century BCE when they tried to take the throne. But over time, the title lost their connection to the Zoroastrians, and the title became exclusively associated with the seers, the folks who could predict the future. They could do all sorts of things. They could heal the sick, they explain physical phenomena, interpret dreams and omens, but they were most particularly known for their astrological practices. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that a magos was one of the priests and wise men in Persia who interpreted dreams, and Tertullian, 600 years later, wrote that the East considers magi almost as kings. Tertullian's words probably are where we developed the misinterpretation of magi as kings. So what we know is the magi were esteemed advisors to kings. They were indeed wise men. And since wise men, the magi, practiced astrology, maybe we should look at Matthew's story in its astrological context. So that's what we're going to do. Who would have paid attention to astrologers? The Greeks. were living in a Greek world in Judea 2,000 years ago, and the Greeks were big fans of astrology. Astrology fit into the philosophy of Stoicism, in which the fates determined the fate of the world. You didn't. Who would not have paid attention to astrologers? The Jewish people in Judea. They did not practice astrology. King Herod, Jewish, his advisors, Jewish, they would not have been paying attention to any astrological portents. They would have been ignorant of the astrological predictions of the Magi. That might be why they didn't know there was a bright star, because there wasn't a bright star, but there was an astrological prediction. What about Matthew? The Gospel of Matthew was written sometime in the years 70 to 90 of the Common Era, and the evidence suggests that the person who authored this Gospel was a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian living probably in Antioch in Syria. And his audience, the folks who read his Gospel, would have been very knowledgeable about astrology. They probably even practiced astrology. So he could have been trying to convince them of an idea by including astrological ideas in his gospel. Why would King Herod, who didn't believe in astrology, have granted an audience to some astrologers? Because they were respected wise men from another country, another land. So he would have granted them an audience to find out what they had to tell him. In the text of Matthew, there's a prophecy. And this prophecy points back to the prophecy of Balaam, who is a prophetic oracle in the Old Testament. According to the prophecy of Balaam, there shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. This story was used for centuries as a prophecy predicting the coming of Messiah. The Messiah would destroy the enemies of Israel. So we should ask, could the story of Matthew, where he says, so it is written by the prophet, be built on the prophecy of Balaam? The answer is probably yes. This could be a story that was invented to convince readers and to establish Jesus as the prophesied Messiah. Was a Messiah anticipated by the Jewish community 2,000 years ago? Yes, quite eagerly. It was a tough time. King Herod had taken full control of Judea in 37 BCE. He was ruthless. He was a despot. He executed 3 of his own sons. It was a rough, rough time. Within the Jewish community, many turned to faith. They listened to fundamentalists who were predicting the Messiah would come. The messianic fervor persisted for more than a century. So the idea that there might be some wise men who would look to the skies in the form of an astrological forecast that would say there's a newborn king somewhere, that would be something that is reasonable to expect. If we're going to do astrology, we need to know when to look in terms of time. So we need to understand the calendar. Most scholars believe Jesus was born during King Herod's reign. He reigned from 37 to 4 BCE. But those dates depend on understanding the calendar itself. The modern calendar that we use was established in the year 553 by Dionysius Exiguus, Dennis the Little. He was a Christian monk in Rome, and he proposed a new calendar based on the birth year of Jesus. Instead of saying this is the 15th year of the reign of whomever, he said, let's establish a calendar based on the birth year of Jesus. So he added up the reigns of all the Roman emperors since the time of Jesus, added them all together and figured out when Jesus was born, and set Jesus's birthday as the 25th of December, 1 BCE. He then defined the start of the Christian era to be 1 week later, on January 1st of the Common Era. There was no year 0. We went directly from -1 to +1. Unfortunately, Dionysius didn't calculate the reigns of the emperors correctly, so he got the years off. He was off by a few years. And when the chronology is redone correctly, we know that King Herod died in 4 BCE. We know that King Herod was around when Jesus was around. So we have a bit of a problem with the era, but this can help us figure out when Jesus would have been born. Why December 25th? That was the day of Jesus's birth as celebrated in 553, but the correct date of Jesus's birth, if it was ever known, has long been forgotten. Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century theorized that Jesus was born in the spring, either April 20th or 21st or May 20th. In the 4th century, the early Christians celebrated the Epiphany on January 6th. They didn't celebrate Jesus' birth. The early church was not interested in celebrating his birth, but was focused on the baptism and resurrection. The earliest reference we have to December 25th is a calendar from 354. But why December 25th? It did not correspond to the Roman festival of Saturnalia that ended by December 24th. In the year 275, Roman Emperor Aurelian decreed that December 25th was the birthday of the unconquerable sun, S-U-N, not S-O-N. This was a big holiday. December 25th was also a day to celebrate what was known as the cult of Mithras. Mithras was an Iranian god. Scholars believe that December 25th probably was chosen to give Christian meaning to what was already a popular holiday. What's important for us is that December 25th has nothing to do with the actual birthday of Jesus. So we don't need to be looking at December 25th. We need to search beyond that. When was the first Christmas? We need a year. Jesus was born, we know, based on Matthew's story, during the reign of Herod. Therefore, Herod died after Jesus was born, and we know Herod died in 4 BC. And we also know historically that Herod died after an eclipse of the moon and was buried before Passover. And in Jewish tradition, the body should be buried within 24 hours. There's only one good option within this time period, and that's a lunar eclipse that occurred on March 12th or March 12th into the 13th of the year 4 BCE, and Passover, which occurred on April 4th of that year. That would pin down pretty approximately or pretty accurately when Herod died. Can we get any help from the Christmas story in Luke? We can try. Luke writes, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child." Luke, we should note, doesn't mention King Herod, doesn't mention the Magi. Quirinius is also known as Quirinius, who was the governor of Syria. Tertullian in his histories held that Saturnius, not Quirinius, was governor at the time of Jesus' birth. And the Jewish historian Josephus places the date of this census as year 6 of the Common Era, not year 4 or thereabouts. This passage from Luke seems to be historically wrong. It's not going to help us. But maybe Luke can help us otherwise. Luke writes that the annunciation of the conception of John the Baptist was in the days of King Herod of Judea. Luke also places Jesus' birth 15 months after the annunciation of John the Baptist. So Jesus may have been born 6 months after John the Baptist. If John was born when Herod died, the latest possible date would be April 4th of 4 BCE. And the latest date Jesus could have been born was October of 4 BCE. Luke also says that John the Baptist began preaching in the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and we know the years that corresponds to. And Luke also says that Jesus started his ministry after that time when he was about 30 years old. So if about 30 means 27 to 33, then the birth must have been between 2 and 6 BCE, which is consistent with 4 BCE, but not consistent with the census of year 6 CE. So we're starting to bracket the time frame when we can look for an astrological series of events. What about that account of Matthew in which Herod murders the 2-year-old children after the Magi didn't return? Why should he kill all the children 2 years or younger? And I want to note here that there is absolutely no corroborating historical evidence that this ever happened. It only appears in the Matthew story. But what does it tell us? The visit of the Magi occurred 2 years after the birth of Jesus, and Herod was still alive at that time, which means the birth occurred probably in year 6 BCE or earlier. So we've got a range of times, maybe year 8 to year 4, but probably in about year 6 is right. If Jesus was born in 6 BCE, then 2 years later, Herod would have wanted to kill all the 2-year-olds or anyone 2 years old or younger. Now let's take a look at some details of Greek astrology and figure out what we need for a royal horoscope. If we want a birth of a king, we need to know what kind of astrological portents would tell us that there's a king who's been born. Remember, a horoscope's an abstract representation of the sky at the moment of someone's birth. The positions can be determined by calculation. You don't need to look in the sky to see this, certainly not for the ancient Greeks who'd figured out how to do these calculations. And what we need is a regal horoscope for about the year 6 BCE. Also keep in mind, a horoscope is not about what can be seen in the nighttime sky. Objects in a horoscope could be below the horizon, or they could be up in the daytime. What do we need for a good horoscope? We need to know about the planets. Each planet has certain properties which cause certain kinds of influences. The planet's influence change depending on what constellation it might be in, or even the individual degree in the sky where you find that constellation, or that planet within a constellation. The horizon, the eastern and western horizons, have particular powers and influences. The ascendant position is the part of the zodiac right on the eastern horizon where objects are rising into your sky, and that spot had special powers. The sign of the zodiac mattered. Different countries were connected with different signs of the zodiac, and different signs of the zodiac had different properties. And the entire sky matters, what's above the horizon and what's below the horizon. There are also what are called aspects, which are triangles or squares or hexagons in which you connect different parts of the zodiac in this circular zodiac sign that you see here. Regal principles, there are a lot of them. None are rare by themselves, but if you put a bunch of them together, you've got a good horoscope. What are known as exaltations are specific locations along the zodiac where a planet is exalted and assumes omnipotent powers. Over here, we have the symbol of the sun in the constellation Aries, the ram. A planet was exalted in its sign of exaltation. That's where the planet would be most powerful, and the sun is exalted in Aries. And Aries is the symbol of Judea. The ram is found often on coins from the era for Judea. Astrologers almost certainly would be looking for a regal horoscope for the birth of Judea that would include the sun in Aries. Now, the sun's in Aries every spring, March and April, so that's a time to look. There are planets which are rulers of the trines. Trines are parts of the zodiac separated by 120 degrees, so these are basically connected by a triangle. And the trine had certain rulers, certain planets that ruled that trine. The trine that includes Aries also includes Sagittarius and Leo. Aries, again, is the most important sign for Judea, and the planets that rule the trine for Judea would be the Sun and Jupiter and Saturn. The rulers are the Sun and Jupiter, the Sun in the day and Jupiter at night. We also want to think about what were known as royal stars, and planets were stars, assumed to be stars at the time. A bright star is most important if it's in conjunction with the moon. Now we can think a bit about this conjunction that happens next week with Saturn and Jupiter. But if a bright star is in conjunction with the moon, that's important. Even better would be if the star is eclipsed by the moon. And because planets were stars, if Jupiter is eclipsed by the moon, that would be a big deal. Jupiter is at its most powerful if it rises just before the sun. It would be even better if that happened when the sun is in Aries, and then Jupiter would also be in Aries. And it would be even better if the moon eclipsed Jupiter at about the same time. So the Magi, being mathematical astrologers, would have studied the planets to find out which planets would be in trine 1. Ideally, they'd be looking for a moment when the sun and Jupiter and Saturn all were in Aries. And since the sun is in Aries, you can see in this illustration here, here's the constellation Aries, over here is Taurus, on the right is Pisces. If the sun is in Aries, then Aries is up in the daytime. You can see the sun, but you can't see the stars in Aries. It's daytime. And if Jupiter and the moon and Mars and Mercury and Saturn are all up with the sun, you can't see them either. If all these three planets are in Aries, the sun, Jupiter, and Saturn, the stars in Aries, this would be an incredibly powerful portent signaling regal blessings for Judea. How often does this happen? About once every 60 years. It's not rare, but given lifespans 2,000 years ago and even now, something that happened once every 60 years for most of us is a once in a lifetime occurrence. It's a rare event. Cardinal points. Let's talk cardinal points. We have the horizon to your left. Think of you as standing here in the middle, and on your left is your eastern horizon. The sun would be rising here at dawn. To your right is the western horizon. This would be where objects descend below the horizon. So you have the ascendant point, the descendant point. Straight above you, what astronomers call the meridian, is midheaven, when the stars and planets are straight up. And then we have the anti-midheaven. This would be where the sun would be at midnight. A planet in any of these four locations is more powerful, more influential than if it's in between the four locations. The ascendant cardinal point and the midheaven cardinal point are the most powerful cardinal points, especially for regal horoscopes. So we'd like the sun and the moon and Jupiter, maybe even Saturn, to be ascendant or in midheaven for a regal horoscope. Attendant planets. Let's talk attendant planets. Here we have a picture of the eastern horizon. You can see early morning twilight beginning here, so the sun's about to rise. Mercury, Venus, Saturn, Mars, the moon, and Jupiter have all risen before the sun. Planets can serve as attendants for the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon were the king and the queen of the sky, and if they are attendants, they are guarding the king and queen of the sky. The moon is protected if Venus or Mars rises after it. So in this situation, Mars and Venus both rise after the sun. So they are attending and protecting the moon. The sun is best protected when Jupiter, here's Jupiter, and Saturn rise before the sun. So in this particular configuration, the moon is protected and the sun is protected. One more thing, any planet's powers are especially strong when it's reborn. Reborn means it undergoes what astrologers would call a heliacal rising, which means it rises before the sun. But it doesn't just rise a moment before the sun, it emerges instantly from being in the glare of the sun. Symbolically, that planet has a death and a rebirth when it's within what was called the arc of combustion around the sun. When it entered that arc of combustion, its power was destroyed. When it emerged, its great powers were at the strongest. So let's come back to this video we saw before and run it again. And here we just had a planet that just went through the sun. We're going to run it forward until the sun catches up with Jupiter. Right now, I'm going to freeze it a moment again so you can think about what's happening. The stars actually rise to your right. So in this fast motion thing, we're watching the planets move, but all the stars rise up to your right. This means the sun would rise first and then Jupiter, which means you couldn't see Jupiter. Jupiter would be in the daytime sky. Venus would rise just before the sun. You'd see it, and then the sun would rise and Venus would disappear. As we run the movie forward again, the sun is approaching Jupiter. The sun and Jupiter are now together. And when the sun and Jupiter were together, Jupiter's powers were erased. But after the sun passes by Jupiter, Jupiter will emerge. Right there, Jupiter just emerged from the sun, and Jupiter would rise before the sun. That's a heliacal rising. One ancient text says that if Jupiter and the sun are in conjunction and Jupiter is hidden by the sun's rays, this diminishes the whole fortune. But if Jupiter, freed from the sun's rays and in a morning rising, is together with the sun in the same sign, this indicates high position and honor. So what would be a regal horoscope for Judea? If the sun is in Aries, approaching the midheaven, if Jupiter and Saturn precede the sun, then they're attendant to the sun and they protect the sun, and they're both in Aries. The sun and Jupiter and Saturn would rule the trines. This would be an unambiguous indication of a royal birth for Judea, because it's all about Aries. Was the star in the east a bright, spectacular event in the sky? No. The people of Judea didn't even know about the Magi's star. How could everyone miss a comet or a supernova or a bright conjunction? They couldn't. Only the Magi knew about the star. That's why Herod had to ask them. So we need to look for an astrologically portentous moment. And let's look in the broad era from 10 BCE until 5 CE, to giving a wide berth to when Jesus might have been born. And let's search for a lunar occultation of Jupiter in Aries, because we know that would be a big deal. There's just one. March 20th of 6 BCE, there are just two, excuse me. Just March 20th of 6 BE, just before sunset in Judea. This lasted about 60 minutes. It was on the western horizon. Jupiter was too close to the sun to be visible. But there's another one. April 17th of 6 BCE, just after local noon. That's what we have illustrated here. Up toward the midheaven, we have the moon and we have Jupiter. And Jupiter is occulted by the moon. We have an eclipse of Jupiter by the moon. This can't be seen. You can't see Jupiter in daylight. But it also turns out that on April 17th, 6 hours earlier, Jupiter underwent a heliacal rising. Back to Matthew. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. Let's think, how does the star appear in the east and then move before the Magi as they travel to the west? An object in the actual sky can't do that. And then how does the star just stop moving and stand above the child? We again need to think like an astrologer. In the east is a literal translation of a Greek phrase, ente Anatoli. Ente Anatoli means at the rising, which is why it's sometimes translated as in the east, but more accurately translated as at the rising. We're not talking about a star in the east. We're talking about a star that is at the rising. And ente Anatoli was a very important technical phrase in ancient astrology, which meant a heliacal rising. At the rising meant a heliacal rising. It means the sun bursting forth from the brightness of the sun and rising just before the sun. The person who told the Magi, the story of the Magi, either told that to Matthew or Matthew came up with it, must have understood the importance of this phrase to astrologers, because he repeated it twice, the exact phrase. When we think of it as a star physically in the east, we're misunderstanding it. This is an astrological term that means there was a heliacal rising, and there was one heliacal rising of Jupiter in Aries between 10 BC and 5 CE, and that was on April 17th, 6 BCE. And 6 hours later, the moon and Jupiter caught up with each other, and we had an eclipse of Jupiter by the moon. That is a very, very powerful astrological event. Antigonus of Nicaea, when analyzing Emperor Hadrian's horoscope, recorded that Jupiter rising in the east 7 days after a close conjunction with the sun was an extremely positive, portentous event. Well, in April 17th, 6 BC, we had Jupiter in a heliacal rising in which it wasn't just a close conjunction, it was an eclipse. One more term we need, went before. Went before is the translation of the Greek word proagen. Proagen comes from an astrological term, proagesius, which means to go before. Or more precisely, to an astrologer, it means to go in the same direction as the sky moves. Remember, in this little video we watched, as the planets move to the left, the sky is moving to the right. So the stars are normally moving in the opposite direction that the sky moves. They're not going before the stars, they're going against the stars. To say the star went before is to use another technical, astrologically significant term. We need to talk about retrograde motion for planets. Planets undergo retrograde motion when they go in the same direction as the stars. So let's understand retrograde motion. In this cartoon on your left, we have an inner planet and an outer planet going around the sun. This could be the Earth, this could be Mars or Jupiter. Looking from the Earth to Jupiter, you'd say, that's where Jupiter is in the stars. And the Earth catches up to Jupiter, and next time you say, well, Jupiter's right here. And then the Earth actually is in alignment with Jupiter, and you'd say Jupiter's right there. And the Earth passes Jupiter, and you say Jupiter's right there. And then the Earth is here, and you say Jupiter is here. And it looks like Jupiter moved this way, and then turned around and went that way, and then turned back around and went that way. Jupiter didn't do any of those things. Both planets kept moving in the same direction around the sun. But as seen from the Earth, when we lap a planet, an outer planet, we see this retrograde loop. This picture is another illustration of the idea of a retrograde loop. Here's another idea. When the star stops in a retrograde loop, that's this point or this point. The star was moving in one direction and it stopped. And then it goes back in the other direction, and then it stops, and then it moves back in the regular direction again. To say that the star stopped and stood over the place where the young child was is, in astrological terms, to say the star reached one of these stations in a retrograde loop. The word ipano is another technical, astrologically significant term. It means to stand over. It means to stop at one of these stations. So now we know Matthew's talking about a planet that went through one of these retrograde loops. This shows you a retrograde loop. We have one planet out here. Here's the Earth on this orbit. We have Mars on this orbit. Watch as the Earth catches up with Mars. Mars looks like it's here and there and there. You're following where it looks like Mars is with the stars. When the Earth catches up with Mars, whoop, we get a retrograde loop. That's what it looks like when you see an outer planet and you catch up with it as an inner planet. Those are retrograde loops. Translating Matthew into astrological terms and looking at the date April 17th, 6 BCE, we would say, and behold the planet, which they had seen at its heliacal rising, which went retrograde and became stationary above in the sky, which showed where the child was. Matthew's astrological statements indicate that not only did the Magi figure out that April 17th could have been an important date, but they continued to watch the motion of the planets after that, after Jupiter's heliacal rising, to search for other regal conditions, and they found those when Jupiter went through its retrograde loops. On April 17th, Jupiter emerged from its heliacal rising, and Matthew talks about that event twice, because that was not an accident. That was the most important of these astrological events. At that moment, Jupiter was occulted. 6 hours later, Jupiter was occulted by the moon. Mars is in Taurus. The sun, Jupiter, the moon, and Saturn are in Aries. You want 4 objects in Aries, not 5, because 5 would be hubris. 4 is great. Most planets are too close to the sun to be visible, so this is the morning sky. You have Mercury below the horizon, Mars below the horizon, the sun on the horizon at ascendant, Jupiter and the moon just above the horizon, Saturn above and Venus above. Saturn and Jupiter are protecting the sun. Mars is protecting the moon. This is what it might look like in the sky, but when the sun comes up, you can't see all those planets. They're above the horizon. Later that same day, we have the eclipse of Jupiter by the moon. In the following weeks, Jupiter is going to move in its prograde direction, and then it goes retrograde. On the 1st of June, or on June 20th, Jupiter leaves Aries and enters Taurus. On August 23rd, it stops at the first station in its retrograde loop. It stood over. It's motionless there for about a week. Then it goes prograde in the same direction as the stars. At position 9, it stops on December 19th. and it stands at that station, and then it goes backwards again. On the 19th of December, when Jupiter stops at point 9 in our illustration here, the principle of the trines is fulfilled. Aries and Leo and Sagittarius are all occupied by their rulers. December 19th is almost as regal as April 17th. The only thing it's missing is that heliacal rising of Jupiter. The horoscope of April 17th, 6 BC is unambiguous if you like astrology. The heliacal rising and the lunar occultation of Jupiter could have been the Star of Bethlehem. It's nothing to see in the sky. But as an astrological event, it would be a big deal. That event could have been calculated by the Magi in 50 BC or 30 BC or 6 BCE. It also could have been calculated by an astronomer 100 years later in 50 or 60 or 70 of the Common Era, and Matthew could have recorded it then. You did not have wise men using a star in the sky as some ancient GPS system to try to find a baby in a manger in Bethlehem. On April 17th BCE, any baby born at any hour, anywhere in Judea would have had the same horoscope. So the astrological story would point to the birth to a regal birth anywhere in Judea on that day. And if, according to Matthew's story, the Magi show up in Jerusalem and ask Herod about it, he would have known that any child under 2 could have been that newborn king, which is why you'd have that story of killing all the children under 2. Why did Matthew write in astrological terms? Because the Jews didn't practice astrology, but that wasn't his audience. His audience was anybody he might be able to convert to this new religion called Christianity. The Jews were waiting for a fulfillment of the prophecy of Balaam, the star out of Jacob, so let's call it a star. Matthew is a message to the entire Hellenistic world, where astrologers wielded an enormous amount of influence. To his readership, astrological prognostications would have been taken very seriously. Everything in the Matthew story could be some kind of imaginative fabrication drawn up decades after the death of Jesus. Astrologers could have calculated backwards and said, we have this person that we claim is the Son of God. We want to convince people that he is the Messiah. Let's look for a horoscope to justify that claim. And they found a horoscope, April 17th, 4 BCE, 6 BCE. That date of the horoscope fits well as the time when Jesus could have been born. And in this way, Jesus's messianic message would have been used to reinforce his authority as divine, at least to those who were inclined to listen to evidence from astrology. So that is a way to use astronomy to try to understand the Star of Bethlehem. In this way of understanding it, the Star of Bethlehem was not a bright object in the sky that 3 kings or 3 wise men or any number of kings or wise men followed from the east to the west by following a star in the east and fixating on a star that somehow just hovered above Bethlehem. None of those things are possible from astronomy, but Matthew seems to tell an astrological story. Matthew includes several very important technical terms from ancient astrology that allow him to tell a story about a moment which corresponds approximately to when Jesus might have been born, which ancient astrologers would have interpreted as a day for the birth of a king. So thank you very much for listening. And if we've got some questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
That was really an awesome talk, Dr. Weintraub. I don't think there's words to really express it. I mean, being honest, I mean, I learned so much there, and I think that everybody else that was watching this evening learned so much because they're all haven't been able to get their questions in yet. So we'll give them a few more minutes.
I hope people aren't disappointed to think that maybe there was no bright star in the sky, but it's interesting to think that what Matthew wrote could actually have been in some technical way right. Mm-hmm. Depends on what you want to believe.
Let me see. It looks like we still don't have any questions quite yet. Yeah, we've got somebody saying mind's blown. So I think that's what's happening is we just got so many people that are just wowed. So in a good way.
Yeah,
But
it's a very interesting story. It is not without detractors for that story, but I think the evidence is very strong that it makes sense that Matthew wrote a story almost a century after Jesus was born, in which he used astrology to justify the claim that Jesus was the Messiah, a newborn king. But the likelihood, again, that there were wise men wandering to Jerusalem, either at the time of Jesus's birth, following a star in the sky, or 2 years later, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
We do have one here. So many times the Bible, with its dates, times, and events, were proven accurate. So taking that into account, are you dismissing the fact that maybe information doesn't align with your facts?
It is certainly, some things in the Bible appear to be historically accurate in terms of their timing. Others clearly are not. So the story of Joseph, going to Bethlehem because of the taxation, the census, is historically wrong in terms of timing. It's historically right that event really did happen, but he got the year wrong. So some things are accurate historically and some things are not. And it requires historians, which I am not, to try to tease those things apart. But there are always going to be different ways that people will come up with to try to interpret different words in Scripture.
Let's see. I had heard that there was a planetary conjunction near 4 BCE. Were there no conjunctions near that time?
There are always going to be planetary conjunctions. Jupiter and Saturn go through a conjunction every 19.6 years. So those conjunctions are not rare. So if there was one in 6 BC, there would have been one in 26 BCE and one again 20 years later. They're regular events. But planetary conjunctions, as people could see in the picture you showed when we started, they're fun, they're neat to look at, but they're not enormously bright events in the sky. And again, if you try to interpret Matthew's story as there being a bright object in the sky that the Magi followed, it's not obvious how you'd follow bright objects in the sky anywhere, because they rise in the east, they go across the sky, and they set in the west. So if you followed them, you'd actually go from east to west, which is not the direction anybody would go if they were trying to get from Babylon to Jerusalem. Right. It just doesn't work. Gotcha. But there certainly would have been other conjunctions at the time. But I don't think a bright conjunction in the sky can satisfactorily explain the Star of Bethlehem.
Okay. What percentage of people at the time followed astrology? Was it relatively common or more for elites?
I think only the elites would have been able to afford an astrologer, but astrology was very, very popular among everybody at the time, other than where it was forbidden. Within the Jewish community, astrology was forbidden. The idea that the stars control our fates, that was not acceptable within Judaism. But within Persia, within all of the Greek Empire, astrology was very, very popular. The average person would not have been able to have a horoscope cast for them, but any ruler would have had a horoscope cast for that ruler and would have used the horoscope to justify their authority, or would have asked for another astrologer to come up with a better horoscope if they didn't like the one they got.
Gotcha. Could the Magi have been astrologers who were aware of Jewish messianic prophecy and based their trip the astrological event because they were curious if the prophecy aligned with their science?
They certainly could have been. It's certainly possible to believe that there were actual Magi who, in the years leading up to 6 BCE, were able to make this prediction. They didn't look up in the sky to see anything. They just looked at their calculations and they said, you know what, on the morning of April 17th, 6 BCE, there's going to be this event. That's a big deal. And they calculated forward and they say, you know what else? 6 months later, we've got this other important event with Jupiter in the sky. This is a big deal. And this big deal means a newborn king will be born on this date, April 7th of 6 BCE. They could have predicted that in 10 BCE, in 20 BCE. So they could have predicted it in order to be in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem on April 17th, if that really was the day of a birth. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't have needed to wait and then show up 2 years later to ask Herod in Jerusalem, do you actually know where we should go? Have you seen this star in the sky? They wouldn't have needed any of that. So certainly, yes, the Magi could have been astrologers who predicted this ahead of time and were sitting in Bethlehem the morning of the birth. But I think it's pretty unlikely.
Okay. There was another question. What was the astrological sign of Jesus? Was it Aries?
Anybody in Judea, there, according to ancient astrology, the astrological sign would have been Aries. So anybody born in Judea would be associated with Aries. Now, if you were born in October, you'd also have a constellation, a sign of the zodiac appropriate for whatever the sign of the zodiac is for October. But you're also born in Judea, so you'd also have Aries as one of your astrological signs. So I would think anybody born in Judea would have one or two astrological signs that are important, one for their birth month and one for the country in which they're born. And every country had its own astrological sign with which it was associated.
Okay. Let's see. I think that may actually be all the questions. Just check one more time here. One person has asked, is your presentation somewhere where they can share it? Because there were a lot of great visuals. We're certainly going to have the recording available on our website, and it'll be on the Vanderbilt YouTube channel.
Yes,
so
where people could find it. I'll also reference most of my information came from a book called The Star of Bethlehem, surprisingly, by Michael Molnar. Michael Molnar was an astronomer at Rutgers for much of his career. So if you want to actually get more of the details of this story from the person who came up with this particular idea for the Star of Bethlehem, look up that book, The Star of Bethlehem by Michael Molnar, M-O-L-N-A-R.
Okay. One final question. This is a great presentation. Did meteor showers or fireballs have any astrological significance?
Shooting stars and fireballs would have had great astrological significance in Babylon 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus, because in that part of the world where astrology began, before they worried about whether Jupiter was rising on the eastern horizon or whether there was an eclipse of the sun or an eclipse of the moon, they were just looking for events in the sky, events in the heavens. So shooting stars, they would have recorded that. Auroras, as I mentioned, they would have recorded that. A fireball, they would have recorded that. Now, none of those things would have indicated the birth of a king or anything else. They would have been signs of the gods sending messages from the sky. Gotcha. And those messages would have been sent to Babylon, to the capital. They would have been translated by the Magi for the king, and the Magi would have told the king, this is good news or bad news. We saw a bunch of shooting stars last night. That means this army is probably coming from this other country nearby. Let's get ready. That's how they would have interpreted those things, as signs about how the king should protect himself or defend the state. But they would have been important signs. By the time of birth date astrology, as practiced by the Greeks 1,000 years later, shooting stars were not important. Fireballs would not have been important.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Weintraub. That was an incredible presentation. And for those that came in late to it or want to share it, we certainly encourage you all to share it. We will have the link still available for this presentation for quite a while, and then we will have it archived on our website. But it'll be around for a very long time. So be sure to come back to our webpage, and the link will be there. Like I said, it'll also be on the Vanderbilt YouTube page. But Dr. Weintraub, thank you so much for the lecture tonight. I think it's a great way to end our 2020 season, and we look forward to having you back next year for another lecture at some point.
And everyone should get out next Monday and look at the conjunction, because it is a beautiful once-in-a-lifetime event to have those two planets so close together. It's a fun thing to get out and see something like that, and everybody should have a Merry Christmas.
All right, well, thank you very much. Yes, and I'll just add to that, if the weather permits on Monday, from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Central Time, we will have a live viewing from our telescope. It'll be virtual, but if you don't have a telescope at home, you can get a look at what it would look like through a telescope. But again, definitely go out and check it out for yourself. And remember, it's only going to be from about 5 p.m. to 6 p.m., and then they're going to be setting soon after that. So don't go out at 10 o'clock looking for the planets. But thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight. I hope you all have a very happy holiday season, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all in person in 2020, but we'll definitely continue, or excuse me, 2021, but we will definitely continue our virtual outreach in 2021 as well. So thanks to all my colleagues at Dyer Observatory, and also Brian Smokler from BU News and Communications. And so hope everyone has a great holiday. Good night.
Good night.